From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Friday, April 17th, 2015. Migrant mothers continue their hunger strike in a detention center in Texas. We'll speak with two organizers, Sameera Hafiz and Jonathan Ryan. And acclaimed author and activist Selma James joins us in studio to discuss socialist cooperatives in Tanzania and the model that they represent for positive change all over the world. That's coming up today after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan, Assistant Professor of Journalism Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
A new investigative report led by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists and the Huffington Post has found that projects funded by the World Bank have, over the past decade, displaced 3.4 million people worldwide. A conservation project in western Kenya, a gold mine in Peru, and a so-called villagization effort in Ethiopia are among the programs sponsored by the World Bank that have resulted in violent outcomes for ordinary people that include losing their homes. The report is the culmination of work by 50 journalists from more than 20 news organizations covering 14 countries. It concluded, among other things, that the World Bank, quote, regularly failed to live up to its own policies for protecting people harmed by projects it finances. Meanwhile, the United Nations announced this morning that 150,000 people have been displaced from their homes in Yemen as a result of fighting in that country and a U.S.-backed war. The number is about 50% higher than previously thought. The UN has asked for $275 million in international aid to help Yemenis, whose country is the poorest in the Arab world. Cristina, whether it's capitalism or war that displaces huge numbers of people, the end result seems to always be this violent result, to be wrenched from one's home, isn't it?
Well, definitely, the displacement of people who are vulnerable to corporate and political structures is indeed a common theme. It's a global problem, as, for instance, we see it in the United States with the issue of gentrification. That's often a consequence. And I think one of the reasons why displacement is a theme, regardless of whether it's capitalism or war, is because really we can't separate one from the other. And in fact, one could argue that the very root of this US-backed war is economic interest, particularly the oil industry. And then if we look into the World Bank, we can also see that the kind of Western conceptions of capitalism are essential to the organization and its practices itself. So what we end up having really is a system where we are essentially an elite minority are leading a war of capitalism, and violence is always going to be a consequence of that.
150,000 students marched in Santiago, Chile yesterday demanding free higher education and expressing anger at President Michelle Bachelet. Bachelet is serving her second term as president and is at the center of a scandal that involves her son getting a large loan. Students who marched are also upset about the involvement of right-wing politicians in a mining company called SQM that managed to avoid paying taxes. One high school-aged protester told press, "We need to protest against this caste of corrupt politicians and businessmen who are involved and who are not ruling for a majority. Instead, they're cooking up the reforms behind four walls." Chilean education is marked by access for the rich, a legacy of the Pinochet dictatorship. More than 130 students were arrested during yesterday's protests. Meanwhile, earlier this week, a former Chilean army officer has been ordered to stand trial in Florida in connection to the murder of famed Chilean singer Victor Jara, one of thousands of Chileans killed by the Pinochet regime. Well, Cristina, how important are these student protests? President Bachelet is not a right-wing politician, and yet Chilean students are holding her accountable.
Exactly, and so the student protests are crucial for various reasons, and I think one of these reasons is that this conversation really shows us that there's a shift in what we call socialism today, right? Chile's socialism today is not the same socialism of Salvador Allende in the 1970s, which is unfortunately why the U.S.-backed coup in Chile in 1973, where Allende was assassinated. And so what we see is really we're fighting against a system that doesn't care about political ideologies. Political ideologies don't matter. What does matter and what continues to co-opt is the neoliberal economic order that we all live in. It's a system that incorporates all politics. So essentially we live in a world where political positions are less effective and really capital is the most important thing.
And speaking of capital here in the United States, Republicans and Democrats have put aside their differences to decide to hand over power to the president. It's an unusual move until you consider the issue at stake, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP, the massive and secretive trade agreement that is opposed by a broad coalition of labor, student, and activist groups, has been all but cleared by Congress for so-called fast-track legislation. That means the president would have the authority to negotiate trade deals like the TPP and present them to Congress for only a yes or no vote without amendments. Republican Senator Orrin Hatch justified the move, saying, quote, "It's important for America, it's important for the world that we get this done." One of the few senators opposing fast track, Sherrod Brown, called it a complete abdication of our responsibilities. TPP is considered NAFTA on steroids. Organizations around the country are scrambling to urge their representatives to vote no on fast-track authority. They think TPP will make human rights, labor laws, and environmental standards subservient to corporate profits. Cristina, does the fact that most of Congress and the president are on the same page on TPP tell us something about how they can work so efficiently when the power of corporations to fleece us is at stake?
I think it tells us a lot. One of the things that we're seeing this week, again, as you said, is the power of capital. I don't think, though, we should be surprised that they would be on the same page as TPP, being that it is the corporation who essentially owns Washington, right? These are politicians who are owned by lobbyists, by corporations, and by corporate interests. And so what this is just a reflective of the corporatist culture, the corporatist structure that we live in, borrowing from Naomi Klein's language, of course. And I think it's important to note, in 2012, The Nation wrote an article that says TPP is just NAFTA on steroids, and that's exactly what it continues to be. It's a corporate coup d'etat, and the politicians are really there just to extend and protect that coup d'etat.
Cristina, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next Friday.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. Mothers being held with their children at a detention center in Texas have been on hunger strike this week. It is the second such hunger strike this month. The women, who are primarily undocumented immigrants from Central American countries like El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, say conditions at the center are unbearable. During the first hunger strike in early April, 78 women signed a handwritten letter which read in part, quote, "We came to this country with our children looking for help and refuge, and we're being treated like criminals, and that is not what we are. We are not a threat to this country." Detainees have complained about the quality of food, the conditions of their imprisonment, and even sexual assault by guards. Some women have been held in solitary confinement. Children as young as 2 are being held with their mothers. The center, designed to hold whole families, has been cast as a humane alternative to prisons. Originally called the Karnes County Civil Detention Center, the prison was recently renamed to the more euphemistic Karnes County Residential Center. Furniture is colorful and kid-friendly. A large painted sign reading "Bienvenidos," welcome, greets people at the door. But the soft facade betrays the fact that it is still a locked facility. Karnes is being run by Geo Group, one of 2 large private corporations that runs prisons and detention centers in the U.S. Joining me today is Jonathan Ryan, Executive Director of RAICES, which stands for the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services in Texas, and Sameera Hafiz, a legislative and policy consultant with the group We Belong Together. Welcome to Uprising, Jonathan and Sameera.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Jonathan, first, tell us about the first strike. One of the women who organized it is this Honduran woman named Kenya Galeano. She was imprisoned with her toddler. She happens to be out now and free. How did women like Kenya organize? Actually, let me ask, Sameera, let me ask you that question. Tell us about the first strike.
Sure. The first strike involved about 80 women that have been held at Karnes with their children. Most of them had passed their credible fear interviews, so they had made an initial showing that they are eligible for asylum because they face persecution if they'll be returned to their home countries. And so they were objecting to both the conditions of their confinement and also the fact that they have not been released pending their asylum applications, and many of them have been held for months, between 5 and 10 months, and with their small children.
Jonathan, I understand that in retaliation to organizing this strike, that the first strike, some of the women were put into solitary confinement with their children?
Yes, that's correct. Unfortunately, we've seen an array of forms of retaliation taken by ICE to various people as a result of these hunger fasts. Immediately after allowing the letter out of the facility that described the reason for their protest, several women were rounded up as the supposed ringleaders of the fast, and they were brought into isolation rooms, which were dark, in which they were kept with their children. These rooms had a single bed, an open toilet and shower, and a sink beneath which you had to cup your hands just to drink water. The women had no control over when the lights were turned on. They were only turned on during meal times. Other than that, they were just held in dark rooms with their children. One woman in specific, Delmy Cruz, who is still, unfortunately, at Carnes, was kept in the room with her 11-year-old son, Alexis. Now, they have been released from the isolation room, but are still at Carnes. And those people who have visited with them following this isolation report that Alexis' entire demeanor and mental health deteriorated rapidly during that time, and that he really has not recovered. We are hearing that he is in a constant state of crying, depressed, failing to make eye contact. It has been a really brutal experience, not just for the mothers, but of course for these children.
Now, Sameera, Kenya Galliano, the woman that I referred to earlier, who was behind the organizing around the first protest, the first hunger strike, had been released. She had a bond hearing after people agitated for her release. She was able to post bond and be released last week. She's now giving interviews about this second strike being conducted by people who became her friends. Who is eligible to post bond? Why are there so many women still being held in the facility? Why can't they also post bond?
Well, unfortunately, the administration has been using family detention as a way, incorrectly believing that it'll deter, as a deterrent effect for immigration. And so rather than assessing whether the detainees pose a flight or security risk, they've been detaining them and not doing kind of an analysis to see if they should be released to the community or other alternative detention. So once an individual has undergone a credible fear interview and passed the credible fear interview where they've made a preliminary showing that they do face persecution if they'll be returned to their home country, they can be eligible for release or for bond. And there's been recent litigation about this issue, and the Department of Homeland Security is not supposed to hold families, including children, in detention to serve as a deterrent. And one of the reasons that that decision was made was because of the impact that family detention is having on children. The mental health impact that Jonathan talked about, chronic weight loss, despair, all of the other things that children are undergoing. So once these credible fear interviews have taken place, these women should be eligible for release or for bond.
So, Jonathan, is this a new phenomenon then, that families initially in these circumstances were being allowed to spend time and live with relatives before having to appear before a judge, and now instead of allowing them to do that, they are simply locking them up because they think it's a deterrent, but now we find out, of course, it's illegal to use it as a deterrent?
That's correct. And actually, surprisingly enough, that practice of releasing women and children from the border continues even to today. And I think this really highlights that this is not an immigration issue. This is not about immigration enforcement or the enforcement of our immigration laws. This is about refugee resettlement and how our country treats bona fide refugees who seek protection in our country. The ironic truth is that today, and if a woman and child arrive at the border and there's no room at the for-profit private detention center, then that woman and child is not apparently a threat to our nation's security, and they are released. So this is really driven by our country's commitment to private for-profit detention and our government's quota, which it has established to keep those companies profitable, of maintaining 34,000 people in detention every night. And so the irony is that, yes, women and children have in the past been allowed to move along after being given a summons to appear at court. And even now, as they have this family detention, women and children still are allowed to move along if there's no room at the inn. It really highlights the extent to which this is really a theater. This is not actually protecting our security. This is really intended to put these women and children, the most vulnerable people among us, in the worst situation possible so that they make desperate pleading phone calls to their families and friends in home country and tell them how awful it is if you try to get asylum in the United States.
Well, Sameera Hafiz, tell us about the transformation of Karnes County Civil Detention Center, as it was called initially, and then changed, having its name changed to Karnes County Residential Center. Photos of the inside of this residential center look like they could be a preschool or a dormitory. You can find children sitting in colorful chairs and rooms that are brightly painted with walls and rugs. This is apparently a concerted effort to give the appearance, I believe, of something that's family friendly. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely the intention. And I think it's very interesting to note that when the Obama administration originally came on, they walked away from family detention. In 2009, they ended detaining families at the Hutto Detention Center in Texas because of an outcry among immigration advocates and detainees there because of the poor conditions and because that Hutto proved that there's no humane way to detain families. And, I myself have visited Karnes. I was part of a tour of the facility in September of last year. And I can say I did see some play structures and some slides and a preschool with colorful chairs, as you mentioned. But that does not detract from the fact that it is inhumane and un-American to hold children and mothers in jail facilities. And I did find the conditions rather dismal when I went there. I spoke to a few women there, and there was a widespread sense of fear amongst them. They were afraid of the staff. Many of them had described that they had threats that their children would be taken from them if they didn't sign papers. Many of them had been told that they could be in jail up to 3 or 4 years. So it is not a nice place, and even if it were, it is not. It is absolutely inhumane to detain families.
Jonathan, Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about this latest strike? So this is a second hunger strike this month. Women, I understand, are refusing to eat meals, and they're ordinarily given $3 or paid $3 a day to clean the detention center, and now they're refusing to clean it as well. Tell us about what form this second protest is taking.
Yes, and just to connect a little bit of this to what we were just previously speaking about, we often call this the bright bedspread syndrome. Being on the ground here, we see numerous people arrive and take tours of these facilities, and they come back and we debrief, and they talk about how much nicer it was than they thought because there's ice cream in the commissary that they can purchase. But what they don't tell you at the tour is that a woman might have to spend an entire day cleaning in the kitchen with boiling water just to earn $3 for her day's work. And still after that day's work, she's not going to be able to pay the $3.50 that it costs to buy that ice cream in the commissary. And so the women have protested the treatment that they've received there, where, yes, even though the bright walls might be there and the play toys might be there, but you know what they call milk or an orange if you happen to sneak it out of the cafeteria to give to your child later on that day? They call it contraband. And we hear stories of guards taking those little bottles of milk away from mothers and pouring them out on the ground in front of them to teach them a lesson about about taking food from the cafeteria when there's perfectly fine milk to be purchased at the center-run commissary. And so the women have had enough. And they determined after the first strike to allow some time for ICE to make decisions and determinations of their requests for release. One woman, Kenya, was given a bond and was released, but many others are still detained. So they undertook a second strike this week for 1 week, during which they would not work, they would not use any of the facilities at the center, and they would only eat 1 meal per day for the week. The reason that they decided to eat 1 meal per day, of course, was because of the threats that had been leveled against them by ICE when they undertook the first hunger fast. They were rounded up, and members of ICE, officials from ICE, told them that if they conducted a strike, they would become unfit guardians, and their children would be taken from them.
Wow. So we are seeing this horrific situation. Well, we're not really seeing it because it's behind a facade, and we're only now hearing about it because these women are very boldly going on this second hunger strike. Let's talk a little bit about the allegations of sexual abuse at the facility. The Office of Inspector General did a report, and I should mention, I understand that the guards who work at the facility are primarily men, even though the prisoners are primarily women and children, and that already sounds like potential for problems. But the Office of Inspector General said they interviewed 33 people. They claimed to have spent 380 hours investigating, and they concluded that allegations of sexual abuse were unfounded, but they did say there were, quote, inappropriate sexual relationships. Sameera, what does that mean?
That's a great question. Yes, so there have been allegations of sexual abuse by the staff and guards at Carnes against the detainees. And as you mentioned, the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General did conduct an investigation. The report about the investigation was very brief, and it does not surprise me at all that it was very difficult for the people that they interviewed to talk openly about any allegations of sexual abuse or sexual misconduct. I think it's very confusing to what and the power and the dynamics of being in a facility and then complaining to an official from the actual agency, the same agency, about the abuse. It's very difficult. So it was not surprising that they were not able to uncover abuse based on their brief investigation.
Now, Jonathan, if you have any thoughts on the same issue, please do tell us if you know any more about these allegations of sexual assault. But I also want to ask about the other centers in Texas where there might be similar conditions as Carnes, but there's also another massive facility called Dilley, in Dilley, Texas, multi-acre facility being run by the other big corporation that does this sort of thing in the U.S., the Corrections Corporation of America. GEO runs Carnes, and Corrections Corporation has the contract for the center in Dilley. Can you, and you've been, Jonathan, talking about how a lot of this is driven by corporate profits. Is Homeland Security and ICE attempting to replicate this kind of family detention, family imprisonment in other parts of Texas and the U.S.?
Yes, absolutely. In Dilley, the Department of Homeland Security has recently, in December, opened the nation's largest detention center for immigrants, and it has been purposed for what the U.S. government now considers its chief national security threat, which is children and women seeking asylum in our country. So we have seen the opening of that facility, and yes, we have, since the beginning of this endeavor, seen allegations of sexual abuse, sexual misconduct in all of the facilities. And I just wonder, what would we expect? Right. Would our First Lady, Michelle Obama, choose a fast food company to administer her school lunch program? Why in the world would her husband, our President Barack Obama, choose a prison company to create a residence for women and children? It's a setup for disaster. It is something that they are simply not equipped for.
And Jonathan, these are our tax dollars. I mean, they're taking our money, yours and mine, and our audience's money, giving it to GEO and Corrections Corporation to imprison mothers and children in these giant facilities. I understand one estimate says something like it costs taxpayers more than $200 a day to house these folks per person, about what it would cost, to go to a hotel or to to pay a hotel per night. I mean, and that's, and then making these women work all day to earn $3, not even enough to buy an ice. I mean, it's just, it sounds like it's essentially a corporate giveaway to these big groups at the expense of the well-being of vulnerable people.
That's absolutely right. And I mean, I hate to burst your bubble, but I don't think that you or I or any of the people watching or listening this show have ever stayed at a hotel for $350 a night. But that, in fact, is the price of maintaining these families. Wow. I have a client from Mexico who approached the U.S. border on the advice of the U.S. consulate because her U.S. citizen's son, 23-year-old U.S. citizen's son, was disappeared by the Mexican Marines. She was advised by the U.S. consulate to approach the border and request asylum with her family. They were all placed into her and her children into family detention, her husband into adult detention. And they remained for 3 months in detention at this exorbitant price. Now, why is the U.S. government not investigating the disappearance of her U.S. citizen son in Mexico? Because we were told by the consulate they don't have the resources.
Wow. Sameera Hafiz, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add 2 things. That one of the things that makes the allegations of sexual misconduct and sexual abuse especially appalling is that many of the detainees are actually survivors of sexual assault and other forms of domestic violence and violence against women. And for them to not only be re-traumatized by being put in detention with their children, but then undergoing further abuse by the staff that's assigned to protect them and keep them safe is especially appalling. And the other point I would like to make is that Jonathan talked about the price of immigration detention, and alternatives to detention, such as release or community support programs, cost far, far less. Some cost pennies per day. So it's just, it makes no sense to detain people at that cost.
And I should
there
mention,
are even cheaper solutions
Jonathan?
in that. There are even cheaper solutions in that these private detention centers sell themselves as providing a service. But the truth is that almost all of these women have relatives and family in the United States who would pay for all of their living costs. We are choosing as taxpayers to pay for their living costs when private individuals are willing to foot the bill. There are cheaper solutions. It can be free for the United States taxpayer.
Right. If we were just measuring by money, and then if we were measuring by ethics, it would also make sense to provide freedom for these women and babies. I mean, babies as young as 2. I'm imagining my toddler.
27 days. 27 days old is the youngest child we've seen.
Goodness.
Imagine that prison ID.
Yeah. So finally, there was a huge controversy last year over the large wave of children coming to the U.S. unaccompanied from Central America, and that exodus was apparently stemmed. There's a lot of controversy around, with Congress and a lot of misinformation around that. What is the current situation of unaccompanied minors as well as minors crossing with their mothers? Are there still large numbers coming across the border for various reasons, economic violence, political violence, etc., organized crime, or have the numbers actually dropped? Jonathan?
Yes, well, our organization, Raíces, conducts about 20% of the nation's intakes, legal screenings for unaccompanied children who are in the custody of U.S. Health and Human Services. And I would distinguish that form of custody from the custody in which these women and children are placed. U.S. Health and Human Services runs shelters that have the single purpose of identifying family members in the country to whom these children can be placed in their custody. But this is a seasonal phenomenon, and certainly this is the season when refugees and displaced people tend to move north. And so, yes, I can report that we are seeing increases in the numbers of at the shelters. There are increases in the numbers of women and children who are coming, but it is lower than last year. This is really mainly due not to the deterrent strategy of family detention, but unfortunately of the harsh interdiction strategy that our government has funded in Mexico and in the Northern Triangle nations, where special forces are basically lining the borders with machine guns, like armies, preventing these displaced persons from moving north. Wow. So they will be increased numbers because there's increasing violence in these countries. That is the reason for their movement. They are fleeing unspeakable violence. Right. So they will continue to come, but we are interdicting them along the way.
Well, I want to thank the two of you so much for joining us today and shedding some light on these issues. Can you both very briefly give out websites for your organizations? First Jonathan and then Sameera.
You can visit raicestexas.org. That's RAICESTEXAS.org.
And Sameera Hafiz?
Yes, you can learn more about the We Belong Together campaign at webelongtogether.org.
And we will post those on our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today as well, in case you missed them. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you, Sonali.
Thanks for your time.
Jonathan Ryan is the Executive Director of RAICES, which stands for the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services in Texas. Sameera Hafiz is a legislative and policy consultant with the group We Belong Together. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Did you know that Uprising is now a TV show as well as a radio show? You can watch the show on Free Speech TV, or you can subscribe to our YouTube channel for a very small monthly fee, which helps us sustain the costs of TV production. Find out more at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Scour the news about the African continent, and more often than not, the news is bad. Whether it's the spread of infectious diseases, the exploitation of resources, the corruption of governments, or the violence of extremist factions, African nations are struggling and have been struggling for a long time. The end of Western colonialism was supposed to be a new chapter, holding the promise of independence and wealth. But the process of Africanization meant that power structures created by colonialism were left in place. Perhaps only the names and faces were different. In the Eastern African nation of Tanzania, one leader named Julius Nyerere foresaw the dangers and led a bold experiment that employed existing rural principles of agriculture with progressive ideals that involved anti-sexism and anti-classism. It was called in the language of Kiswahili ujamaa, which roughly translates into familyhood. The concept was a traditional Tanzanian framework of socialism under which intentional villages were organized. While the concept blossomed and manifested into many villages, proving that development could mean equality and anti-capitalism, it was a short-lived experiment. Luckily, a Rhodesian man named Ralph Ebot and his wife Noreen witnessed the flowering of Ujamaa and documented it in book form. That book has recently been re-released with an introduction by my guest, Selma James, who also co-edited the book. Selma James is an internationally renowned women's rights and human rights activist. She's also the author of Sex, Race and Class, The New Terms of Unity. She's the founder of the International Wages for Housework campaign, the coordinator of the Global Women's Strike. I'm so pleased to welcome her in studio today. Thank you so much for joining us. I should say welcome back. We had you on about your book, and it's wonderful to have you on the show.
I'm delighted to be back. Thank you.
So first, this incredible concept that is something that is not very familiar to us in the West. Before we get into that, let's step back and talk about history. Tanzania got its independence from Britain in 1961, and Julius Nyerere was its first prime minister. He was an extraordinary man. Tell us a little bit about him.
He was absolutely extraordinary. He came out of his village of Butiama when he was 12 years old for the first time and learned how to read and write. He went to school when he was 12. And the most extraordinary thing about him was, though he got a couple of degrees later on, he retained the view of the village. That remained his point of reference. That was how he saw the world, and that's how he thought his policies should be based on, was what the village needed. He began really very early. He wrote a paper when he was still at university on the treatment of women in African society, and he thought it was absolutely horrendous. And as he grew in stature and also in power in Tanzania, he outlined just how hard women worked. He said they work all the hours in every week. And he said men are on leave for half their lives. And that had to change. It had to change if the society was to develop for women's sake, for men's sake, and for the nation's sake. And he was incorruptible and always responsive to the needs of the grassroots. Now, you don't get that in anybody else.
And he had incredible foresight. He realized that if we simply left the structures in place left by colonialism, that it would spell doom for many African nations, including Tanzania. And so he had this just this incredible idea of, and explain how he came to this idea, because it wasn't something brand new that he just invented. He actually developed it along with existing traditional principles, right?
Yes, he knew that they had to do something to get the country out of the poverty that colonialism had left it in. They didn't have any specialists. They had no doctors, no nurses, let alone the idea of a hospital was very far away. They had no teachers. They had no educated, skilled people. He said, but what we have is a collective, a communal principle and tradition, and we can use that tradition to develop the people within the villages, which is for him what development was, and bypass capitalism at the same time. He said, however, the traditional society had two weaknesses which we must address. The first is the fact that women were subordinate to men and worked very much harder than they did. And the second was that it didn't get them out of poverty. So they had to do agriculture in a more organized and scientific way, and they had to relieve women of the burdens, and the men had to share the burden of work of the society. But working together in the old principles of communalism, they could do this. And he said to the people of Tanzania, do it, you must do it, because nobody else could do it for them. He understood that. Either the people did it or it wasn't done.
Right.
And some people did it, and they were tremendously successful, and the idea spread. And they developed ways of getting everybody's view and bringing the women into decision-making, not as a little clique or a few people that were let in, but that the whole community met 2 or 3 times a week and had a meal together, served by the young people, not by the women.
Young men and women.
That's right. And then they made the decisions for the following days, the whole village.
So these, it sounds like overlapping principles of collectivism and socialism. Tell us about the Arusha Declaration, this policy of the party that Julius Nyerere led on socialism and self-reliance, and how it laid out in clear terms that it was important that a few people not be allowed to just benefit from the work of many.
That's right. He was against capitalism. He said most people worked, but few people benefited. He said we're against that. We Africans do not have that tradition. Everybody works in African society and everybody benefits. And he said that is the principle on which we must build our economy and our social relationships. And by 1967, the villages of the Ruvuma Development Association, they began with 1, and then they were 2, and then they were 4, and then they formed an association of all the villages, and finally they were 17 by about 1967 when he issued the Arusha Declaration to say, we want Ujamaa, and we want to limit the power of ministers of government and anybody in authority, and to limit their wealth so they could only own one house. And for the purposes of the Arusha Declaration, he said, that means the man and his wife, or the woman and her husband. So one house to a family, and various other measures, which was to undermine the growing corruption which naturally flowed from a few people getting power in the society, and the imperialists always ready to buy their way back.
Right.
And what is astonishing to me is that as famous as it was in the 20th century, in the 60s and the 70s, by the 21st century, people say, what is the Arusha Declaration? Because it was even out of print in Tanzania before we reprinted it in 2007.
Tell us a little bit more about the villages. I understand that they were limited in size on purpose because after certain, when things get too big and get too unwieldy, then power structures can develop. What did they look like?
Well, they were very successful. One village, the village of Litoa, which started out, and people came to them and said, well, we'd like to join. And they said, well, I'm afraid you can't, because we want to limit the size so that when we come together, everyone will have a chance to speak. Everyone will be completely engaged, and everybody really was engaged in the society. They said, but we will help you to form your own village, and we will give you food to start out with, we will train you, we will share our skills with you, and most important, we are building a school in Litoa, and your children will be educated there for free with us.
I want to talk about that school because that's very important. You have a big part of the book by Ralph Abbott that you co-edited on that school. But just staying on this for a little bit. So the vision, as I understand it, was that rural Tanzania would consist of these villages whose standards of living would little by little increase to that of urban centers. But they would still need the state to enforce some of the aspects of the Arusha Declaration to make sure that that there would be equal distribution of wealth and resources?
Not really. Within the villages was the equal distribution
So there
of
was
resources.
full autonomy.
They were not only autonomous of the government, but they kept saying, leave them alone, do not interfere with them. It's not ujamaa unless the people doing it are absolutely in charge. And he fought his own government to keep their hands off. They wanted to be in charge. They were power hungry, as politicians always are.
How did they administer justice then? For example, when there were issues of crime and justice, and
we didn't have crime, and I say we. I feel I'm living in these villages, but they didn't have crime in those villages. They sometimes had people who didn't want to work. Yeah. Sometimes, not often. And then they would have a meeting and say, look, you're not pulling your weight. And if he didn't, they would ask him to leave.
And this is, again, part of this whole concept of familyhood, because when you have a family, you try to work things out. You don't toss your own members of your family in jail.
Absolutely. That is exactly right. And he called it African socialism, as opposed to the socialism that he had seen when he was at university in the UK, being built, the welfare state. But the welfare state was to protect people from the worst aspects of capitalism. But ujamaa was not about that. It was not to have capitalism in the first place, and for the people to be in charge of their own production, development, when they built houses, when they improved them, what kind of education they had, what were the relationships among them, which were very straightforward. And one of the most extraordinary things is that they really didn't have any domestic violence in the villages. And you ask them at the time, why not? And they would say, well, we don't really approve of it. That is, the opinions were good and sound and not sexist. And the weight of other people's opinion in the village really mattered and was a power and was effective.
So people held each other accountable.
They did.
Yeah.
That is exactly right. They held each other accountable, and they found that this was a joyous life. Everybody said, you know, that they were very happy in Tanzania.
This is totally going against the U.S.-centric, the sort of what you find here in the United States, a celebration of personal and individual responsibility and freedom. This is collective responsibility, and these are almost sort of opposite views of how society could function and be.
Yes, and that didn't mean there wasn't individuality, because individuality flourished in these circumstances because they were living in a society which was not against them. You know, we are not aware sometimes at how much the society that we live in stands against us, not only if we're people of color, but if we're women, and if we're children, and if we're the elderly, and if we're poor. The society doesn't seem to be on our side, but against us. We thrive perhaps despite this, but not because of it. And the Ujamaa Society, they were making it to suit themselves and for everybody to find their way together.
I'm speaking with Selma James, who is actually on a speaking tour of the United States, and she just returned actually from Philadelphia. For our audience in Los Angeles, she's going to be speaking tomorrow at Saturday, April 4th at 4 p.m. at the Southern California Library, 6120 South Vermont Avenue. She's going to be speaking alongside Pierre Labossiere and Margaret Prescott. She's on her tour with Nina Lopez, who also co-edited the book Ujamaa. And the event is called From Ujamaa, the Hidden Story of Tanzania's Socialist Villages to Today's Black Jacobins in Haiti, which is the topic of another interview as well. She's also going to be for our Bay Area audience in the Berkeley, San Francisco, Oakland areas. A number of events, Berkeley Sunday, April 26th, so the weekend after. Before that, she will be in Oakland Wednesday, April 22nd at 6:30 p.m. at the LA Commune Bookstore and Cafe, and Thursday, April 23rd, as well at 6 p.m. Friday, April 24th at 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Saturday, April 25th at the Crucible in Oakland from 1 to 2 p.m. We'll post all of this information on our website, uprisingwithsonali.com. Also in New York, for our New York audience, Thursday, April 30th from 4 to 6 p.m. at the Commons, 388 Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. So we post all of that at uprisingwithsonali.com. Selma, let's turn to the Litoa School, because the education of children was crucial to pass on the collective knowledge, the principles and the ideas of Ujamaa, not only to pass them on to the second generation, but also to spread them far and wide beyond these villages. How were these schools run?
Well, first of all, they were building Ujamaa. This wasn't handed to them.
Right.
They were making the society every day. And the first and most important thing about the school was that it was not competitive. The children were not competing with each other. Can you imagine a school?
No grades, no testing?
That's right. Can you imagine a school where children are not vying for top marks against the people they care about and their colleagues? It was not like that. They worked together. The question was to be collective and cooperative, and the kids were, that's how they were raised, and that's how the school was run, and they were learning all kinds of skills that have to do with living in a rural society, so that they were not on track to then go into the city and get a degree and be in charge of people like villagers, rather than be part of an expanding and developing really imaginative and creative society. And they were also would go to they went to the headmaster. I know in one case, because the headmaster told us, that the man who was at that time, they came and they said, we don't want this guy to be in charge. And he paid no attention. And they said, excuse me, we don't want this guy to be in charge. And he said, well, I had to remove him, didn't I? You know, because the kids had some views about the way they wanted government, the government of their society or their corner of society to be run. And they learned all kinds of skills, including from the Ibbets, Ralph and Noreen Ibbett and their children. And they brought the skills that they had learned in Western society, and they made them available, and the children learned at one point.
So this was not a Luddite experiment. Tell us about
Indeed.
Ralph Ibbett and Noreen Ibbett.
Well, at one point, the village, one of the villages, which had some part quite chilly on the mountaintop, near the mountain, decided to grow sheep and do wool. Noreen imported a spinning wheel and learned how to use it and taught others how to use it. And so they had wool yarn, and everybody in the village would go around knitting down the road. Women and men were knitting because it got cold in the evening in the winter. And that was how the children, learned what Noreen and Ralph brought with them. At one point, Ralph was able to get in Litoa, and then he was working on getting it for the other villages, piped water without electricity. And the women said it was just like heaven, because there was no more fetching of water, which usually was women's and children's work. That was eliminated.
Grinding work, very difficult work. So step back and tell us who the Ibbets were. This Rhodesian couple.
No, they were English.
They were English.
Well, he was English, and she was raised in Ireland, and they worked in Rhodesia for about a decade against apartheid. They were trying to run a multiracial cooperative farm, and they had problems with the apartheid church and with the government there and the rest. But Ralph and Noreen learned a great deal. First three of their children were born there in Rhodesia, and he learned about the soil, and he learned about farming, and he learned about helping collectivity without being in charge. And so when he was invited by Milinga, who was the leader of Litoa village and the leader of the whole enterprise, probably an extraordinary man from every account, when they invited the Ibbets to come, Ralph and Noreen had some African experience behind them. They never attended a meeting where decisions were made.
I see.
They
stayed out of it.
outside of the government of the villages, but they were available for advice and for help. They were consultants, and they got £50 a year, I think. That was their wage from a charity in England.
For doing that,
It was a prototype of how Europeans, or indeed Americans, can be available to non-industrial
like
countries
true solidarity.
Without being in charge.
Yeah, it sounds like solidarity at its purest
form.
What
I know. Can you use this information? And Nyerere was the man who promoted that. You mentioned in your intro something about Africanization.
Yeah.
He was not really interested in Africanization. He was interested in the best people doing the work, and African people governing themselves in a way that prevented the domination of the specialist, of the educated, of the technocrat.
The technocrats.
That was his point of view. That was his direction, because he saw that a country like Tanzania needed what the West had to offer, but it didn't need the domination of the West. It needed the collective wisdom of the people in an active and ongoing way.
What happened to these villages? You mentioned at its peak it was 17 villages, and I want to sort of circle back to what I started out with, which is that post-colonialism in Africa has been more tragedy, at least for certain countries, than success.
Many successes took place, were won. But the problem was to keep the ambitious at bay and to discipline those who had positions of power. And it's all the same everywhere. We're having the same problem in the UK,
Absolutely.
and you're having a lot of it in the US. The politicians want to do their way, which profits them, which promotes them, which increases their power. And we are often not organized enough, or there are not enough of us organized to defeat that and to find our own way. And that's what happened to the 17 villages of Tanzania, the Ruvuma Development Association. They had the support all the way of the president. You know, he backed them constantly, but he could not defeat the leadership of his own party. And those are the ones who he went on a trip, some international meeting that he had to attend, and as soon as he was out of the country, they destroyed the villages so that they were destroyed by the time he got back.
So
and
party
he was shocked
politics,
by what they had done.
Party politics destroyed the Ujamaa.
It was the ambitious. It was those in the party who were ambitious, those who were in the government. You know, there were signs that this was the problem, this was the basic problem, because at one point, you know, he had said that university students had to do voluntary work for the community, and they said they didn't want to. And he just he closed the university. He said, you mean we are paying, the people are paying for your education, and you don't want to work for them, go home.
We just have a few seconds left. Selma, what's the promise that Ujamaa holds for a model for organizing today?
I think the principles of Ujamaa, the way people worked, the way they controlled their leadership and in fact encouraged their leadership without domination, and the structures that they devised in order to govern themselves, and the principles on which, the collective, cooperative principles on which they organize their society, can be learned and can be used in any circumstance. We in the Global Women's Strike, we use Ujamaa as our guide for organizing ourselves and for promoting all who do the same. And
that story is available. Those principles are embodied in this book by Ralph Ibbott that you have co-edited and written an introduction for, Ujamaa, The Hidden Story of Tanzania's Socialist Villages. Selma James, thank you as always for joining us.
I'm delighted. Thank you.
My guest, Selma James, is an international women's rights and human rights activist. She is also the author of Sex, Race and Class, The New Terms of Unity, and the founder of the International Wages for Housework campaign, coordinator of the Global Women's Strike. If you'd like information on her events and appearances in Southern California, the Bay Area, and New York, go to uprisingwithsonali.com a little bit later today. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. And Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.